terrible the way people just don't expect English speakers to speak languages. It's like that out east.
Oh, it's true, yeah.
You get that here, people just don't expect it.
They don't expect it.
I was meeting this morning with a lady I've known about 15 years, and she said to me like halfway through, like, Russian, you probably pay you Russian. It's like speaking English, you know, you can speak, I can't believe this. She never imagined it was really possible, but you're English. Yeah, you're English.
Доброго дня, шановні.
Good morning, esteemed colleagues. We are going to start the briefing. And the topic is role of media in highlighting conflicts, and Keith Richburg and Peter Dickinson are our speakers today.
Please, Keith, if you would like to start, and then Peter, you'll take over, and we'll sort of go from the little introduction to a Q&A session.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me here. I'm Keith Richburg. I want to also just thank the U.S. Embassy here in Kyiv for inviting me out here. They've got a wonderful speakers program where they invite out not just journalists but all kinds of speakers. So if you're not following the U.S. Embassy on Twitter and Facebook, you're going to miss all these great speakers who they bring out. So you can follow them there. My name is Keith Richburg. I've been a journalist for most of my life. I spent about 33 years with the Washington Post. So this new title I have, Professor of Journalism, is fairly new. I've only been doing this for the last 2 years or so. I started out, I'm not that old, I started out as a summer intern when I was still in university actually, and then joined the Washington Post just upon graduating. And I spent most of those 33 years with the Washington Post outside of the US. I was in Asia for about 10 years of that. My first posting was based in the Philippines, covering Southeast Asia. Then from there I went to Africa, where I was based in Kenya and spent about 3 years there. From there I went back to Asia again, based in Hong Kong. From there I went to Paris, where it sounds like that's a great job being in Paris for the Washington Post, but I was actually almost never in Paris. I was actually covering a lot of the conflict in the Middle East between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I did that for about the first year in Paris. I went to Paris in the year 2000. So my first year was covering the second Palestinian Intifada or insurrection. Then came 9/11, the attacks of 9/11 on the U.S. So I ended up going to Afghanistan and covering the conflict in Afghanistan for the next couple of years. And in 2003, I ended up going to Iraq after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. So I covered Iraq for several months as well. Been going back and forth to Pakistan. And then I came back to the U.S. for a while and then went to China in 2009 and stayed in Beijing and Shanghai in China until 2013. And that's when I decided to leave and did a couple of other things, decided to try to do some writing and then teaching. And then I've now been running this journalism program in Hong Kong for a while. So in those years, I managed to cover quite a few conflicts, not because I was any kind of a war junkie or someone who gets the adrenaline from covering conflicts. It just so happens that some of my assignments took me to places where there were a lot of conflicts going on. And I should say by conflicts, I don't just mean war, which is one thing, but it also can just mean civil unrest. It could just mean demonstrations. Most of the conflicts I covered were actually people in the streets demonstrating and protesting for democratic rights. I mean, sort of like what happened here in 2014, except the difference was in some of the places I covered, they were much more violent. A lot more people were killed. 20 years ago this year, I was in Indonesia, where the people were on the streets for many months trying to get rid of the dictatorship that had been there for some 30 years. And you had these kind of people power movements going on in a lot of places across Asia. So those can actually be sometimes as violent and disruptive in a short spasm of time as some of the other conflicts that I covered. While in Africa, I spent a lot of time in Somalia and also a lot of time in Rwanda. So I understand a few people here are familiar with the genocide that happened in Rwanda as well. I'm just here for the first time, actually, in Ukraine. My knowledge of Ukraine was really formed because when I was based in Paris, one of my jobs was covering the European Union. And I covered the EU from 2000 until 2005. And during that period, we covered NATO expansion to the east and also the EU expansion. So I did travel quite a bit to the Eastern European countries, specifically Hungary. And I remember traveling around the border between Hungary and Ukraine at the time, but this was my first time actually coming into Ukraine. I did spend a little bit of time in Moscow, not very much. In 2001, to get to Afghanistan, the only way to get there was to travel through Moscow to Tajikistan. So that was one of my earlier trips into the into Moscow at the time. After the Soviet era, I had been there once or twice as a tourist when it was still the Soviet Union. And again, I mean, I'm here to learn as much from you about what's going on here and the conflict going on in the East as I can talk. But I can just at least give you some thoughts that I've gathered over the years from my time having covered so many of these conflicts, and I'm anxious to hear what my colleague over here has to say as well. But one thing I can say is that I've noticed that over the years, journalism and journalists play an important role, both before the conflict, during the conflict, and after the conflict. Before conflicts, the media can actually be a driver or a motivator for violence, as we've seen. I mean, that was the case, for example, in Rwanda, where you had a radio station that was actually, it was called in French, Radio of a Thousand Hills, Radio Mille Collines, which is the nickname of Kigali, which was actually incentivizing or imploring people to go out and commit massacres against the Tutsis. I remember this radio station would be on the air telling people the graves are only half full, you must hurry the job, you must clear the fields. They were using various code words to get people to go out and attack and do these kind of massacres. So radio especially, but media in general, can be a driver of conflict. We're seeing that now in Myanmar, in Southeast Asia, where the media is actually helping fan some of these Buddhist attacks against the Rohingya minority and helping drive them out by posting some fake news, some fake photographs, claiming there are Rohingya terrorist attacks going on when there are not. So there are many, many examples where the media can fan violence and fan the flames of conflict. But interestingly, I think the media also can play an incredibly important role in helping tampen down or help diffuse violence, and also playing a key role in the post-conflict situations. For example, I mean, there are several examples of this going on, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, which gets really exciting, I think. But, for example, the media can provide an early warning system when there's a ceasefire into effect. If there are incidents or movements of troops, et cetera, the media often can be the one to first let people know that there's tension building, that there's something afoot, et cetera. So the media, instead of fanning the flames of violence, can help tamp down violence. Often the media can do a good job of helping tamp down violence by not reporting things. And I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive for a journalist. I generally believe that often you need to report things, but I remember this actually happens quite a bit in my home country, the United States. Often when there is urban unrest or riot situations going on, the local media will get together and decide not to over-dramatize or over-publicize it because they don't want to fan the flames of things. They'll wait until the situation is under control before announcing it, as just a way to kind of keep the community safe. I grew up, I'm 60 this year. I grew up in the 1960s. I remember in my hometown of Detroit, Michigan, we had a very violent riot. I think it's still the worst riot in American history. About 40-some-odd people were killed in this riot. And I remember at the time, this was 1967. The following year, 1968, is the year Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I remember there were small pockets of people forming in their various parts of the city, but the Detroit media got together and decided to kind of calm things down, not publicize it, wait till the police had things under control. That was an example of how the media got together and said, this is our city, we need to kind of tamp down on violence. So the media does play an important role in some kind of things like that. The media can also play an important role in a post-conflict situation in terms of bringing people together. This happened, for example, in South Africa after apartheid, where the media sponsored, especially television and radio, sponsored these forums called peace cafes, where they would bring together people from both sides of the apartheid struggle and have them speak. They often could not get people to come together into the same room, so what they would do would be interview them separately and then put the pieces together on TV. But it was a way of getting people to kind of realize that, hey, this person, I can now understand their fears a little bit better because I've heard now what they have to say. And so bringing people together, or media providing a forum for people to come together, I think is one crucial thing that media can do in the post-conflict situation. And the other thing, I think one of the most crucial things that media can do in the midst of a conflict and afterwards is to collect evidence real fact-based evidence, eyewitness testimonies as to what really went on. Because if there are war crimes being committed, if there are human rights atrocities being committed, we need to know that, we need to have that documented. And journalists are often the first people on the scene to see things, or talking to people as they're coming out of areas that are in conflict. The media are the first ones talking to refugees. It's really important to document those accounts in as much detail as possible, because this could become the basis for any future evidence of war crimes or crimes against humanity. That was very important in Rwanda, where I was during the genocide period, that we tried to talk to as many refugees as possible to get as broad a picture as possible as to what was going on. That should be the case, I guess, with a lot of you now dealing with the situation in the East. Just try to make sure everything you get is documented as closely as you can. Just a couple other little points I'll make, and again, these are just more random points in terms of covering an actual conflict, because you're in a conflict situation now, so it's a little premature to talk about the post-conflict situation. But at the moment, I always tell my journalists, and I should say I was the foreign editor at the Washington Post for a long time, so I was responsible for about 25 reporters out in the field. I said, look, there's no story worth dying for. If you're a journalist, your first obligation to your family, to your readers, to your employer is to keep yourself safe. Your first job is to tell the story, and you can't tell the story if you're injured or if you're dead. So your first job is to keep yourself safe. If you die, it's another story. Journalists should not be part of the story, so please keep yourselves safe. I think all journalists should have some training for dealing in hostile environment situations. Unfortunately, I know a lot of journalists now go into these situations without any kind of training. A lot of freelancers, stringers are trying to make their name by going into dangerous places without the equipment, without the institutional backing. That's really dangerous. I think news organizations should not take stories from freelancers in dangerous places like that. It's just it's a way you're going to encourage young people to go out and get themselves hurt. So the number one point is people should need to know how to keep themselves safe. I think journalists, second point about covering conflicts, I think journalists need to understand that there is a need for military secrecy. So we have a right to know, and we want to put everything out in the public, but we do need to understand that soldiers in combat situations are putting their lives really at risk. And so there's going to be a time when they need to keep things secret. We need to balance military secrecy versus the public right to know. And it's a tricky balance. I mean, it always is a tricky balance, but journalists just have to be aware. You don't publish everything you know. If we knew during World War II, if we knew that there were plans for the Allied forces to invade Normandy and kick out the Nazis, we would not have published that on the front pages of any newspapers until the invasion had happened. You don't risk military secrets. You don't risk military lives simply for the sake of publication. The third point about covering conflicts that I've learned over the years, and this is very subtle, which is the visual media often can exaggerate or amplify conflict. And I say that because I remember being in Afghanistan, Kabul, in the capital, for example, when there's an attack going on or fighting going on, and the camera can zone in on the one block or the one area where there's a real intense firefight going on. What the camera doesn't show you is that 6 blocks away, people are shopping and going on about their normal life. So you have to be very careful, especially for the visual journalist, that you're not giving a distorted picture of things, that you're giving a more complete picture of things. And sometimes the media can actually be a go-between between hostile forces that can't talk to each other. Sometimes they send messages through the media. We often saw this in the Middle East a lot, where they would use the media as the way to get messages back and forth, or they would say, you should come and cover this statement because they have a peace offer, but they don't quite know who to make it to. They can use the media as the go-between. So media should be alert for that. Media should also be alert that everyone's always trying to manipulate us all the time. Every time. And that's a big danger we fall into. I've seen this now I've seen it over the many years, but I see it now fairly recently. For example, in the situation in Syria going on, we often get these photographs or images of what are supposed to be atrocities or chemical weapons attacks. Often they are true, often they can't be verified. We just don't know. We just need to remain skeptical all the time as journalists and make sure you know who's giving me this information. Can I confirm these images are real some other way? It's very difficult to do, obviously, in some situations, but we can't be so quick to rush things in and rush in with accusations. We have to recognize that all sides are often trying to manipulate the media. There's an old saying in English, I think by a British journalist, who said, in war, truth is the first casualty. And that holds as true today as it did when he uttered those words. And then finally, just the last point I'll make about that, and we could talk again. I mean, I'm really looking forward to the questions and the conversation. You have to be very, very careful when you're using terminology in war, because terms can carry loaded meanings. Because I noticed that people here even refer to the eastern, they refer to it as conflict area or conflict zone. They don't call it the occupied zone, or whether you call people rebels or invaders or insurgents or freedom fighters. I mean, all of these terms carry different loaded meanings. As I've learned that the hard way in over many years. I mean, when you refer to someone as a guerrilla or a terrorist or a freedom fighter, those are really, really loaded terms. So you really have to be very careful and pick your words wisely. At the Washington Post, we always had a rule: we don't refer to anyone as a terrorist. And even people during 9/11, we didn't call them terrorists. We called the act they did an act of terrorism, but then only if another government labeled it as an act of terrorism. Because in the mind of the person doing it, they're probably not consider themselves a terrorist. The way that gets really tricky is when you're in a situation like the Middle East, where one side wants you to call someone a terrorist, but the other side doesn't consider that person a terrorist. They consider that person a freedom fighter. So you really have to be very careful. As journalists, what we really need to do is just try to stick to the truth and be as fact-based as possible and not get swept up by using the terminology that one side or the other side wants. So I've spoken a long time here, so I think I'll stop here and hear what my colleague here has to say, and then maybe we can get a conversation going.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Good afternoon. Also, I'd like to thank the Media Centre for having me. My name is Peter Dickinson. I'm a British journalist and media owner. I'm a publisher of 2 English language magazines here in Ukraine, Business Ukraine magazine in Kiev and Lviv Today in west of Ukraine. I'm also a fellow with the Atlantic Council. I've been in Ukraine for almost 20 years now. I came for 1 year and never seemed to get away. You know, one thing led to another, and I'm still here with great pleasure. And I've been fortunate enough to work in a lot of different areas of the English language media over that period that I've been in Ukraine. Television and print media mostly. So I'd like to share a little bit of my experience over the last few years, and specifically in the context of information warfare and how I see it playing out, and why Ukraine has been so perhaps uniquely vulnerable to information warfare, why Russian campaigns have been so successful since 2014. My first point of departure would be what I was doing at the time of Euromaidan. At the time of Euromaidan, I was running a Jewish TV news channel for Mr. Kolomoisky. It was called Jewish News One. It was an attempt to create a Jewish Al Jazeera, as it were. Why he wanted to do that, I'll leave to one side. But that was I was the general producer of the channel. I was the chief editor of the channel. And we were producing this Jewish news channel while the Euromaidan process were going on. And the Russian media was telling everyone that this was a fascist uprising. And we were having phone calls from Moscow telling us and telling the leadership of the channel and some of the key figures that they needed to immediately leave Ukraine as quickly as possible, because all the Jews were going to be killed and it was a terribly dangerous situation. And they were telling the people in Russia, no, it's quite okay. We're here in Kiev. We're on Maidan. We support this. It's very good. You know, we really hope they succeed. We hope to have a democratic breakthrough. And the people in Russia said, no, you don't understand. It's on TV. We've seen it. You've got to get out. The fascists have taken over. You don't understand? It's on TV. We've seen it all. You people don't know anything in Kiev. So you can imagine we were in Kiev, literally on Maidan, being told that we didn't know what was happening on Maidan because on Russian TV they had the truth. That was the introduction to the power of this phenomenon of how dominant it can be for people who are these were not stupid people. These were very senior people. This was senior members of the Russian Jewish community who were obviously very educated people, experienced people, but they genuinely believed these things. And I was often in between them, between the different Ukrainian and Russian Jewish organizations, as they argued amongst themselves, and as they both sent letters to Israel saying, this is great, this is terrible. They're fascists, they're pro-democracy. And the situation continued for some time. There was no resolution. Then I remember very well one morning coming into work and hearing the news that Crimea had been invaded, that the occupation of Crimea had begun. The Russian forces had seized the parliament building in Simferopol. And lo and behold, at the same time, allegedly Ukrainian nationalist Bandera fascists had attacked the synagogue in Simferopol. Now, we very quickly got word from the synagogue and from the rabbi that actually he was fleeing to Ukraine because he was afraid that the Russians were invading. But the Russians were promoting it, saying, oh my God, look what the Nazis are doing now. So this was a very interesting vantage point to see how powerful this was. And of course, while I was seeing it here in Ukraine, I was watching how this affected the international audiences. And this went on for a long time. As you're all very much aware, I'm sure, that this narrative of this far-right Ukrainian, either it was a fascist coup, or it was a CIA coup, or it was a Zionist coup. There were a lot of different scenarios, but it was always this extremist plot takeover that was, to counter the idea of a popular uprising. And this gained quite a lot of traction in the Western media, and certainly in the alternative media it gained enormous traction, partly due to the fact that there is a lot of suspicion in the West about mainstream media. There's a lot of skepticism that has emerged over the last 20 years or so into the mainstream, I would say, with key events like 9/11, like the Iraq War and the weapons of mass destruction, these sort of key flashpoints. But a lot of them historical conspiracy theories that have been around for centuries have come out of the woodwork again. And this all fed into the idea that the Russian narratives gained quite a lot of traction. But I think Ukraine was perhaps uniquely vulnerable, and remains so, because it is such an unknown quantity to international audiences. Ukraine never, in all the years that I've been here, really addressed the issue of its international profile, and therefore when Russia began to publicize various derogatory and damaging versions, they were basically playing to quite a receptive audience, because people didn't know anything about Ukraine. Ukraine was essentially a blank sheet. So if Russia wished to draw a swastika on that sheet, they could do so. There was nothing to counter that or to make people say, hold on, that doesn't really fit with my perception, because there was no perception. Ukraine was a mystery, was an unknown quantity. So Russia was able to basically say what it wanted, and then the task for Ukraine was to come up and say, no, that's not true. Now, of course, the person who comes up and says that's not true is always a little bit less believed than the first person. That's human nature. And that was the thing that Ukraine found itself fighting against from 2014 onwards. After the Jewish channel, when the conflict escalated and Mr. Kolomoisky became a governor of Dnipropetrovsk, he no longer had a need for a Jewish TV news channel, so that ended. But he did still have 1+1, and he did still recognize the need for English language news. And so I was asked to establish Ukraine Today TV channel, which we established in the summer of 2014 at the height of the conflict. The name Ukraine Today, I would say, was actually an attempt to troll the Russians, I believe, by Mr. Kolomoisky. Frankly, I didn't approve of that, but it was not my decision to make. He thought it was funny, it seemed to me. So we went ahead with that. But again, that channel from day one was fighting a very difficult battle to try and counter all of the existing information that Russia had been able to put out very quickly, very efficiently, and very loudly through all the different channels that it had at its disposal. Now, people talk a lot about Russia Today as a channel, as a flagship channel, and I think that's true, that's valid, but I would say far more important is the information that gets out into the mainstream via friends of Russia or sympathizers of Russia, or those who are probably more numerous skeptics of America. People who are, by definition, skeptical about American power, and therefore they will back Russia because they see Ukraine's position to be fundamentally a proxy for America. So there was an awful lot of people from the left wing mostly, but also the far right in the Western world who've been very vocal in their support of Russia and very critical of Ukraine, largely based on a sense of anti-Americanism. And we see this very much across Europe. We see it in America, but I think across Europe it's probably more prevalent. Newspapers like The Guardian in Britain, which is a centre-left, probably I would say, newspaper. It's quite sympathetic to left-wing causes in general, and it gave a lot of column space to opinion pieces which were quite bluntly accusing Ukraine of being somehow a far-right coup, of being a hotbed of fascism or Nazism, and repeating a lot of Russian talking points quite openly. Again, this stuck to a degree because people were suspicious of the media, because they knew nothing about Ukraine, and because it was quite an engaging narrative. It wasn't a positive narrative, but it was kind of engaging, it was kind of dramatic. It sounded more plausible to some people who just couldn't believe that this country had been living under oppression and they were rising up. That wasn't very European. People didn't, the idea of Ukraine being a former colonial country that was actually rising up against an inheritance of colonial rule seemed a little bit implausible to many in the West, because for them those things don't happen in Europe. That's an issue for Asia perhaps, or for Africa or South America. It's not an issue that European nations genuinely deal with. Actually, that is the truth for Ukraine, but that's not something that they're familiar with. Now, I'd like to be able to say that all these issues have been resolved and everything now is clear, but it's not the case. The situation continues. And I'd like to draw your attention to a very good example, in my opinion, of these trends, which happened yesterday, or in fact this morning. The coverage of the incident in the World Cup, which you may have seen, where the Croatian player, after having defeated Russia in the quarterfinals, made a video saying "Slava Ukraina," "Davai, davai, this is for you, Ukraine," which was perhaps naughty, perhaps a little bit mischievous, provocative certainly, but nothing out of the ordinary, nothing exceptional, but it caused huge scandal. The Russians were very, very upset about this, which is interesting because officially Russia's not part of the war, so why they should object to someone saying "Slava Ukraina" is not clear. But anyway, to put that to one side for a moment, I think what was interesting is what we saw. The Western media obviously had to report this. And in doing so, they had to explain, what does Slava Ukraina mean? Where does it come from? What is the context of this phrase? And again, we come back to what my colleague mentioned about the power of words, the importance of words. Some reported it quite accurately, I think, and said it's a patriotic Ukrainian saying that has gained in huge popularity in recent years and dates back to the early 20th century, has a long history in the Ukrainian national liberation movement, and is associated also with the Second World War, the controversial insurgency of the Second World War. I think that would be a fairly reasonable assessment. Now, I'd like to read verbatim, if I may, what The Independent wrote. The Independent is a British newspaper owned by a certain Mr. Lebedev, who you may be familiar with from his days with the KGB. He wrote, or his newspaper wrote, in the video posted on YouTube, Footballer Vida shouts glory to Ukraine, a populist phrase that continues to be used by many Ukrainians after events 2004, when a pro-Russian government was overturned. Excuse me, I think they've edited it. Sorry, I've just read up to it. Excuse me, they have edited it. Fantastic. Well, I'll have to refer to my previous notes then that I posted on Facebook. Bear with me one moment.
If I may, the Ukrainian embassy in the UK, they wrote a tweet saying that it's not true. It's not, glory to Ukraine means like long live the Queen, and sort of.
Yes, no, they did this morning. Yes, it was very impressive, and
they had to edit it.
Yeah, well, the newspaper had referred to it as an anti-Russian nationalist phrase, I believe, which became popular during the Maidan coup, which literally could have been written by the Kremlin. So for this to appear in the British media was quite striking. Now, the guy who wrote it, by all accounts, and I checked him out this morning, seems to be a young sports writer. I doubt whether he is a specialist on Ukrainian politics. He may be, but it seems unlikely. So the implication here would be that someone higher up the chain edited this and added this in and put this in there and slipped it in there. Now, of course, this is a beautiful conspiracy theory because the owner of the newspaper is directly linked to the KGB. So it's a particularly bright example, but these things go on quite a lot, and it's very often in this sort of areas where it happens, not in a direct attack on Ukraine, but somewhere around the side, where they're just saying, okay, it's a football, it's the World Cup, and by the way, Ukraine, they're all fascists. This sort of thing continues. But I think what we saw this morning, which was very impressive, I was tweeting about this first thing in the morning. I picked it up from someone else. I began tweeting about it. Other people began, and within a few hours, the Ukrainian embassy in Britain had picked up on it, had responded to this, had specifically referenced them. This is one of the great strengths of social media. They had literally, tagged the people in, said, this is incorrect, please refer to this, here you go. Now, I didn't know this when we sat down here. That's fantastic that they've corrected that. That's wonderful. That's how Slava Ukraina. That's great. But I think this is an area where it can be done, and in some respects, it's an opportunity where you see these mistakes, where you can say, hold on a minute, and I think personally it's very important not to be too aggressive about it, not to be hostile. I think a lot of the time people may do this without being engaged in it or invested in it themselves. They may simply make a mistake, they may have been misled, they may think it's not a particularly important issue, they may just refer it to, they may think it's normal. But I think the linguistic issue for Ukraine is hugely important in the English language media in terms of perceptions. To come back, to take a step back again, to go back to the chronology of the conflict, I think when it began in East Ukraine especially, in fact, let's go even further back to Crimea. I remember interviewing a senior correspondent from the Crimean conflict who was from, I won't name him personally, but he was from a major Western media outlet who'd been in Crimea during the takeover, and who had actually had previous experience in southern Russia and Chechnya with the Russian army. So he was very familiar with the Russian army. And I asked him, you saw these troops in Crimea, they were fairly obviously Russian. I mean, I knew the minute I saw the news from Russia and Crimea and the first videos and the first information, it was obviously the Russian army. But the Western media did not report it as such. Now, this was a man who'd been there and also had experience. I said, well, you must have known this. And he said, of course I knew it. Of course I knew. He told me his story, but he'd contacted his editors back in his home country and said, he'd written reports saying they are Russians. And he'd been questioned by them saying, are you 100% sure? Do you have confirmation from Russia? No. Do you have their identification? No. Are you sure? Yeah, I'm 100% sure. Well, no one else is saying it, so we're not going to be the first. We're going to hedge it. We're going to say they are, they say they're not. And that's what they did, and so this approach created the environment that allowed the takeover to continue, although it was pretty obvious to everyone what was going on. And then we saw the situation repeated in East Ukraine again. And when East Ukraine began, we had talk of Ukrainian rebels, and then they became pro-Russian rebels, and then they became Russian-backed rebels, and then they became Russian-controlled separatists. Now, I'm an extremist here. I believe they are hybrid Russian forces. That's my personal preferable term. I believe they are controlled by Russia, armed by Russia, largely manned by Russia, and fundamentally fighting for Russia. So the fact that some of them are from the local community is not definitive, in my opinion, but that's by the by. But the importance of the terminology used is huge in terms of the way it's perceived by the West, because people in the West, and let's be frank, are not particularly engaged by Ukraine's problems or Ukraine's agenda. They're not, and that's not something that Ukrainians should be offended by. How engaged are you by what's happening in South Sudan or East Timor or wherever it may be? People aren't. They have their everyday problems. So the terminology that's used is very, it frames what's happening, and it frames, is Russia at war with Ukraine, or is Russia just supporting someone else who's at war in Ukraine, in the same way that we may be supporting someone in Syria, or we may have backed someone somewhere else. I think that it's important to get that right. On the local level, I think it's also extremely important. I think we've seen a very positive move away from this euphemism, in my opinion, of ATO. This is what they called the conflict here, the anti-terrorist operation, which in my opinion was a disastrous terminology. I think the word terrorist in general is very interesting to hear your comments on that. I think in general it's been devalued and politicized and made redundant almost. But to call an operation against a force that has around 700 battle tanks terrorists is bizarre. I mean, that is not terrorism, that's war. That is on a different scale altogether. What to do about these situations, what to do from a Ukrainian point of view, what constructive advice perhaps I could offer. I think debunking is good. I think factual approaches are good, but I don't think, sadly, that they're enough. Ukraine has been a leader in this. Ukraine created the Stop Fake initiative in March 2014 in response to what was happening in Crimea. I've been in disbelief, having talked to the Stop Fake guys, and literally being unable to comprehend that the world wasn't somehow stopping this, and that these lies were being propagated. But if you look at Stop Fake, for example, if we can, to take some, to give it a generic overview, you might have a lie or a fake news item which will be viewed on Russian federal television, for example, by 10 million people, and the debunk of it will be viewed by 10,000 people. And it's there, and they've said very clearly and very professionally, this is a lie because X, Y, Z, this is rubbish. But who saw it? Unless we have legislation which forces the person who broadcast this to broadcast the rebuttal, it's of limited use, I would say. It's of limited use, and this is one of the big problems with debunking. There's no way of getting proportionality in terms of the reach. In fact, this week, in 2 days' time, I believe, we will have the 4th anniversary of the famous crucified boy of Slavyansk, the 3-year-old boy who was taken with his mother and crucified, and then his mother was dragged around a square which doesn't even exist. The square, not only the boy doesn't exist, the square doesn't exist. I mean, this was such an incredible piece of theatre that I think it deserves far more attention in the international media. That's the level we're at, dealing with Russia. But it continues. So I think the only real constructive approach, certainly professionalism, certainly fact-based reporting, but I think also a engagement with the public about media literacy is very important long-term, and this may well have to be something that begins at school age. I see this happening now more and more. A lot of countries are starting to develop these sort of programs, and obviously at the top end we've got university-level journalism skills for professional journalists. I think we need to look at informing our general public from a very young age about how they consume information, because the experience of Ukraine has shown us that this is not just about carrying opinion, this is a war machine, and the conflict in Ukraine is probably the purest information-driven war that the world has ever seen, and it should be a warning for everybody. And this is not just something that is not just something. I say Ukraine is very vulnerable, was very vulnerable, remains vulnerable to this, and that's true. But we're all vulnerable to this. And Ukraine now is in a position where it can help the rest of the world to protect itself by learning from the problems here and picking up the solutions Ukraine has. So thanks very much. I guess we'd like to take questions.
Yeah. Can I just make a couple of comments? Because I just was jotting down some really interesting points while you were speaking there, which I agreed with everything you were saying there. One thing that I wanted to say is that on this idea of terrorism and how the word has become, devalued. I agree. I couldn't agree more. I remember when after the attacks of September 11th of 2001, 9/11, basically, President at the time, George W. Bush, said, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And the idea was to round up an international coalition that would fight terrorism. So various people decided that, I want to be with the U.S. in this coalition. So in Turkey, the Turks said, okay, well, we're against you, but we want the Kurds declared terrorists. And, the Russians, Putin said, oh, we're with you, but we want the Chechens declared terrorists now. And Hu Jintao was president of China. He said, yeah, definitely we're with America. But by the way, we have these Uyghur separatists over there. We want them declared terrorists. So basically everybody went down their checklist of the people they didn't like and wanted them to declare terrorists as their price for joining the coalition. And so, and to this day now, we see this word used now to devalue any or to take away the legitimacy from any of these insurgent groups. I just found that was interesting that you pointed that out, how the word now has become kind of overused. But in terms of media literacy, again, that's something I think is crucially important. We teach that at my university in Hong Kong now to all of our journalism students, and we've developed a news literacy course that we are now trying to take into high schools for younger students, because learning how to read the internet is as important as learning how to read a book used to be. With a book, we know how to look in the index to see if things are supported in the references, but not everybody knows how to do that. We pass around items that are sent to us. Or people will forward you something, or you'll see something on Twitter and you might forward it on without checking to see, number one, is this a legitimate news source? What's the URL on this? Who are the persons reposting this or liking it? If you get an item and you notice it's being forwarded or reposted by a bunch of racist groups or fascist groups, you may not want to repost that. You may want to look at who it is who's passing this around. But those are the sorts of things we try to teach people, which are some basic things that you can do if you get a piece of information before you decide whether to publish it or pass it on. And then finally, just tagging on what you said, it was so absolutely true that Ukraine was a blank slate. When the Soviet Union dissolved, most people, including myself, didn't really have a good sense of what all of these former Soviet republics were. And, look at news organizations like my paper, The Washington Post, New York Times, all the big ones. We don't have that many foreign correspondents. It's kind of a myth that we cover the world. We have a few. Washington Post has maybe 25 foreign correspondents. And traditionally what happens is we divide the world up into regions. So, for example, the person in Moscow is responsible for covering all the former Soviet republics. And the problem with there's reasons for that is because nobody in the world speaks Ukrainian who's not from Ukraine, so you had to have somebody who speaks Russian. So that you had people based in Moscow, and their job was to go down and cover the 2014 revolution or Euromaidan. Yeah. And so I think therefore the reporters coming in always had that Moscow-based bias or perception, I should say. Inevitably, and they come down here, and they'll spend 2 or 3 weeks here covering a story, then they want to get home to Moscow, where they live. Nobody covers Ukraine from Paris or Brussels, it's always covered from Moscow. And I think that might be a portion, and that's true a lot of places. I mean, South Africa was always, people in South Africa always covered parts of Africa, so they brought that kind of bias with them. Tokyo covers Korea, so they always have that bias. And so we just have to be very careful. I think maybe it would be a good idea for foreign editors in America or Britain to mix it up a little bit and maybe have different reporters, not just always the Moscow reporter covering Ukraine.
No, absolutely.
Just to pick up on that point very briefly, that is coming from someone like you who has experience of managing these networks. That's fascinating to hear, because that is a major point of contention for Ukrainians here. There's been and it's not to say that it's not to be unfairly critical of the Moscow correspondence. I think there's a human nature factor here. People live there. Very often, someone who is a Moscow correspondent is someone who studied Russian at university, who studied Russian literature, who came from a background of Russian cultural studies, has spent time in Russia. Of course, they are, their whole understanding of Ukraine is through a Russian prism. So even though they may be sympathetic to certain aspects of Ukraine's political objectives, or say Euromaidan, for example, or the nation building, or all these issues that are so key at the moment, inevitably they will introduce a Russian element there. And then there's a practical matter, they're all accredited in Russia. They have, there's certain issues they don't go very far on. They don't really push the issue of Russia's war in Ukraine, which is obviously a huge issue, which should be the number one issue, but they're kind of sensitive about that. They don't go hunting down Russians who fought in Ukraine. They don't go and chase the stories of the graves of soldiers that have appeared that are mysteriously, how did these soldiers die? Nobody knows. They don't push that. A good example recently, the agency France 24, the French state broadcaster, did a series of reports on the Wagner troops who were killed in Syria recently. In February this year, by all accounts, a large number of Russians in an army which is often referred to as mercenary, which is essentially Putin's private army, essentially, which he uses for wars like Ukraine and Syria, were massacred in Syria. And then the whole thing was covered up. France 24 actually went after some of these families, reported on them, and lo and behold, the Russian government now has issues with their license. They may not be, their accreditation might not be renewed, they may not be welcome anymore in Russia. So that's a factor. Of course, if you're living there and that's your livelihood, you're going to be aware of that. And you may say, well, you know what, I'm not going to go on that story, I'm going to go with this story. That's human nature. Is it realistic to think everyone's going to have a Kiev correspondent? No, it's not. It's a big country, but there's a lot of big countries. I personally would much rather see them sending someone in from London or Paris or Berlin or wherever, anywhere but Moscow, frankly, anywhere but Moscow. But let's see. I mean, there's different ways of approaching, but certainly it's an issue.
I'll just add before you get to the questions, because when I was in the newsroom in Washington a few years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and in the Washington Post, we still didn't know what to call it. We were still calling it the Ukraine. And we didn't know what you're supposed to call it, so we called somebody in Moscow and said, "What do you call this country?" And of course, they said, "Na Ukraine, na Ukraine," or something like that. So it was many years before we decided to take off the word "the," and it wasn't because that we didn't mean anything against Ukraine. We just didn't have any background knowledge of it, and so we just had to rely on what the experts told us, and the experts were all based in Moscow. Should we take questions?
Please.
I think there's a mic wandering around.
Колеги, давайте
Dear colleagues, let's proceed to the questions. You just raise your hand and I come up to you and give you the floor. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Andrei Mil, Institute of Liberalism. So we discussed a lot of problem in previous situation. What can we do now and in the future to put Ukraine on the map in media all over the world?
It's good. The question, what to do now to get Ukraine on the map? It's a good question, and it's a hard question. I mean, again, as the example with was that the Independent paper you just as the example with the Independent showed, just social media now is terrific at letting you at least be able to correct misimpressions that are out there. But I mean, it means people, I guess everybody, being vigilant about monitoring what's there, and when you see mistakes being made, as happened here in this case, I guess just being more aggressive about saying, hey, that's not accurate, that's a mistake. I found that most journalists don't want to make mistakes; they want to get things right. And so if somebody, when I was still reporting for the Washington Post, if someone emailed me and say, hey, this isn't quite right, I made a point mentally the next time I wrote about that story to get it correct. I just learned when I was here recently that when they had this referendum in Crimea, that some journalists, and again, they didn't mean to do anything negative against Ukraine, but they just flew in at the very last minute, they covered this thing, and then they wrote that 95% of the people, or whatever it is, voted for independence.
110%.
Oh, sorry, 110% voted. That means all the babies and everybody else was voting. But again, they just kind of didn't do the background reporting on that. But again, I was told then that people then contacted this journalist from a very well-known newspaper and pointed out these discrepancies, so that journalist won't make that mistake again. Now, maybe it's too late to correct the first mistake, but again, I think being vigilant, using social media, pointing out errors. I found that most journalists are very ready to admit that they got something wrong or correct their mistakes, as long as it's done in a respectful way. I mean, if you start putting on Twitter, this journalist is an idiot, then they're going to shut you down. But if, I always responded if I got a respectful call or an email from someone saying, hey, look, I enjoyed your story, but you got this part wrong. I always respected that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think social media is a huge tool here that can be, but it needs to be used correctly. I think that I would strongly encourage any of you who have English language skills to use them as much as possible in very simple ways, and to be aware that Ukraine is unknown. So sometimes you've got to slow down and take it simple, just explain things very clearly. Put it out there. Put your stories out there. And although I don't want to advocate for, a rose-tinted view of Ukraine and to make things look better than they are, or to whitewash the problems, there is an issue in Ukraine of overly negative coverage. I think it's part of the Ukrainian national psyche, in my opinion. People are very comfortable complaining, saying, "Oh, this is bad." I always joke that if you have two Ukrainians, one of them will say it's bad, and the other one will say, "No, you're wrong. It's much worse." This is the nature, and that's very, in many ways, that's a very, very positive thing in a sense that it keeps you grounded. But having said that, there is room for a little bit more talking up achievements sometimes. I mean, there are a lot of wonderful aspects of Ukraine. Tourism, for example. I mean, if we take a specific example, the European, the Champions League final in Kiev a month or so ago, when Liverpool and Real Madrid came to Kiev, I spent a lot of time with the different fans here. They were all almost universally absolutely amazed at how beautiful Kiev was, how attractive it was, how wonderful the restaurants were, the bars, the clubs, the streets, the beaches, I mean, you name it. They were just thrilled. And they had no idea. They'd never heard about this. They'd never heard that Ukraine was a beautiful country, that people were friendly, they were educated. No idea. Then you look at the Ukrainian media, and certainly social media, and it was a lot of complaints about, oh, there's a lot of litter in Shevchenko Park. Oh, there's a bit of a mess here. Oh, look, they closed a road there. This is not good. This was a wonderful opportunity to say to the international audience, look at this beautiful country. Look at this amazing success. Now, I'm not saying it might not suit a lot of your journalistic profiles to have been the person to do that, but I think this is an area where you could have done more to manage that and to promote that and just say, well, this is legitimately a great success and a great example of what Ukraine has to offer. You do have to sell yourself in this world. That's not the job necessarily of journalists. I appreciate that, your job is to be objective and to present a real picture, but the real picture can also be positive sometimes.
Can I just add too, because I was just thinking of this. When I was a foreign correspondent, I was one of these, what we call parachute journalists. I was based in one place, but I had to constantly parachute into countries I didn't know much about. One of the ways I learned about those countries was by talking to the local journalists. For example, when I was based in Hong Kong, I had to cover Indonesia. I didn't know much about it, but I would constantly go straight to the Jakarta newspapers and TV stations, just talk to those journalists. They would help me set up appointments. They would explain things to me. So when you get those parachute journalists coming in from Moscow, or which pretty much where they come from to cover Ukraine, I hope you all make yourselves available, help them set up appointments, help explain things to them, and that would probably go a long way towards, increasing their understanding.
Yeah, just to back that point up and to offer a counter to that, I mean, the Russians are very good at that. I remember going back even further to the Orange Revolution in 2004. A lot of the journalists I'd met were receiving hospitality from the Yanukovych camp directly. We were living in five-star hotels, and we were receiving very good treatment, which of course has also influenced them. And of course, then who would they turn to for advice? They would turn to the people who they'd already received such help from. So, I think the journalistic grapevine is very important. And again, this is an area where I think that a lot of the Western media will refer to their Russian colleagues, although they're aware of the information warfare tactics deployed by Russia. They're aware of the whole concept of fake news emanating from Russia, but they at least will see it as somehow familiar people in familiar positions with familiar brands. I mean, TASS, for whatever it may or may not be, still has a ring. It's like a global brand. Whereas, Unian, they don't know Unian. They don't know Interfax. They don't know these Ukrainian brands or Ukrinform. But that doesn't mean that they won't communicate. I think it's very important to develop those bridges and to develop those relationships. And I think in the future that can work both ways as well. There'll be times when you may well have the need to get information from your fellow journalists also in the West.
Hello, thank you very much. Very interesting. I have a remark. Is it on? Yeah. All right. I have some thoughts on the choice of the discourse and the choice of words. And you say that the word terrorism is being, it's losing its effect because we use it too much. But in a situation like this, to my knowledge, calling it a war is the same as an international war declaration, which will have major political effects that we might not want. So what are your thoughts on that, like the effects of journalists using those geopolitical terms? And the second one, about the constructive approach that you just named about, talking positively about Ukraine, for instance. What about the rhetorics about Russia when it comes to, let's say, a more constructive peace-building approach? Because certainly the Kremlin's affairs are not necessarily all Russians' doings, if you know what I mean, like the Russian people. I'm just curious to hear a take on the constructive approach to that.
Okay, thank you. The first issue about the terminology, I suppose you could call it the legal implications of calling it a war. But I think they are for the government, and the government does not call it a war. Russia is an aggressor state. It's a conflict. It's joint. They jump around it to avoid calling it a war, because there are various implications there. As far as I understand the issue, they would not be able to receive certain international financing. They would not be able to apply for certain, they would not be able to raise money certain ways, bond issues, international aid, IMF funding, etc. So there are legal implications. To draw a parallel, Britain, at around the same time as the Vietnam War, in fact just before the Vietnam War, Britain fought a 10-year war in Malaysia against communist insurgents, which they called the emergency, for tax reasons, basically, for insurance reasons, because if they called it a war, none of the British companies operating in Malaysia would have been able to keep their insurance. They would have lost it, and then it would have been a redundant campaign for Britain if all the British businesses were out. So they spent 10 years fighting a full-scale military operation, which they called the emergency. The British had a similar approach in Northern Ireland, which they called the Troubles, rather than referring it to as a war. Although that was probably more valid in the sense that it wasn't a full-scale campaign, but there was a military occupational component. There were soldiers on the streets, so to speak. But I think that's an issue. That's essentially an issue that is more immediate for the government themselves in official terms than with the media. I personally don't think that the term conflict is misleading. I think, I would use terms like the military conflict, military intervention. I use the term war in my work. I use the term war. I use them interchangeably. I don't use the term terrorist. That's one of the few that I do steer clear of. To touch on your second point, and I'll hand over, if I may, just the issue of Russia, of how to address peace building with Russia. It's a huge challenge to assess to what extent it is just the Kremlin and it's not Russia. I mean, what do we see? It's nice to think that. Of course, it's comforting to think that Russians are peace-loving people who want the same as us. But but there's no evidence to support that. What do we see? We see that Putin invades Ukraine. His popularity ratings go through the roof. He invades East Ukraine. They go even higher, and they stay there more or less. And they're only starting to come down now because he's raised pension rates, not because 10,000 Ukrainians are being killed, not because Ukraine's been driven to this terrible situation that it finds itself in. No, that's by all the indicators that we have, and they may not be accurate. Now, this is an authoritarian regime, so public opinion polls are questionable. But the trend is still very clear. The war in Ukraine is broadly popular with the Russian public. So building bridges with the Russian people at this stage is very problematic. On what basis can that happen? My personal opinion is that the situation will remain very tense for an extended period, unfortunately. But I believe that ultimately there will be a coming together of the Russian and Ukrainian people, because fundamentally they are very, very close, historically, culturally, socially, and on a family basis. On a family basis, I think it's very common. It's almost unusual not to have family on both sides of the border. So I think ultimately we are going to reach that point, but I don't think it's going to be soon, and I don't think it can be something that can be driven from the top, because the divides now are shockingly deep. I mean, as someone who's lived here a long time, I never thought. I think it's a sentiment that most people here would probably have shared. The idea of Russia and Ukraine at war was just absurd. Absurd. You know, I would have laughed you out the building right up until that morning in February 2014 when Russia invaded. Right up until that, I remember 2 days before they invaded, I remember writing a message to a friend who'd posted on Facebook about Russian troop movements around Crimea and saying, "Are you mad? Are you stupid?" You know, I just regarded it as being total idiocy. You know, and of course the joke's on me because he was right and I was totally wrong. But that's the level of you know, that's how shocking the breach is. So I think long term there's going to happen, but I think it's a very, very difficult situation at the moment. And if people try to force it from the top, it could even aggravate it more.
Yeah, I can't add too much more because I'm not an expert on this region about what the Russians, you know, whether there's some connection between the Ukrainian people and the Russian people. But I would just say that you know, knowing China a little bit, when you live in places where there's no free flow of information, the things that people know are often surprising to you. I was actually surprised when I was, you know, in China and I was talking to some young Chinese and I would mention Tibet and the Dalai Lama, and they would say, "Oh, isn't he a terrorist?" You know, and I said, why on earth would you say that? Because that's all they've heard for, you know, through official media channels over and over again. And it's not, you know, they didn't have any hatred, you know, in their heart. They just were told that over and over again. And I tried to explain, no, the Dalai Lama is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And I said, no, but he's a terrorist, right? So, you know, you never know what people are hearing and when there's no real free flow of information and the media is so tightly controlled. In terms of the language, yes, I understand that governments and diplomats have to be a lot more careful in their language because saying certain things trigger legal things, but we're journalists and we have to be as truthful as possible. I remember, you know, when the situation was going on in Sudan and, you know, there was a genocide going on against the people in the Darfur region, and nobody in the government wanted to call it genocide because to do that would trigger a whole lot of other things that they didn't want to trigger, like they would have to intervene to stop it. So we danced around the term all the time. I think the Secretary of State at the time said acts of genocide may be being committed, but he wouldn't call it a genocide. You know, same thing was going. You know, same thing we see going on now with the Rohingya situation in Myanmar. People don't want to use the word genocide because if you use that word, that triggers certain things legally. But that doesn't stop journalists from reporting what's going on and calling it what it is.
Ще запитання?
Any other questions?
I work for Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and I would like to hear your opinion, both you, Mr. Dickinson, and you, Mr. Richburg, about a challenge that Ukraine has been facing for all this time, but this emerges from time to time again and again. The balance between pluralism of opinion and freedom of speech and preventing journalists who are acting more like propaganda agents than journalists. How to find this balance? For instance, recently there has been an OSCE conference here in Kyiv, and I suppose Mr. Dickinson is aware of the situation. And two of invited guests were journalists from Russia, workers of state-controlled media, who were often writing highly manipulative materials. And of course, Ukraine prohibited them from entering the country. And after this, there has been statements of the OSCE that there are problems with freedom of speech here in Ukraine, and so on and so on. What is your expert opinion? How Ukrainian state and Ukrainian media workers should behave in this situation to avoid this accusation of limiting freedom of speech on the one hand, and ensuring freedom of speech and truth of news that are being reported at the same time? Thank you.
Oh, that's a great question, and I'm not sure I have a very good answer. So, yeah, I mean, you know, I'm a strong believer in freedom of speech and the idea that everybody should be able to say anything, you know, even if it's nonsense, and that it's up to people to have to differentiate what's real, what's truthful speech and what's nonsensical or what's lies, etc. I know it's difficult sometimes for people to know what's true and what's not true when so much information is coming at them. But I'm not a big believer in restricting people from coming in and saying things, even if what they're giving you is going to be a pro-Russian propaganda view. I think as long as people are labeled and you know that this person is representing state media, they should have somewhat the right to say what they want, because I'd be a hypocrite to say they shouldn't be allowed to come in and they should not be allowed to speak. We're having the same debate in the US. We haven't figured it out yet. You know, we believe in freedom of speech. I believe in freedom of speech, but that also means there's a lot of hate speech floating around. But I would not want, we have newspapers, we have Nazi newspapers and Nazi websites in the States. We have racist, I don't know if you know the Ku Klux Klan, racist organization. Yeah, they have websites, they have statements. I would, I think everything they say is disgusting, but I would never want them to be shut down. Because it's just better for them to have their poison out there and let people read it and see how horrible it is. But I never would want them to be shut down as much as I hate what it is that they're saying. So I think, freedom of speech is hard. But I believe, I'm an old fan of Thomas Jefferson, who said, it's a marketplace of ideas, and out of that marketplace ideas, the best ones will come to the top. But you have to, unfortunately, allow a lot of garbage to float around in that marketplace before the good ideas come up. Again, that's not a good answer, I know, and I know you're in a unique situation here because you've got a deliberate disinformation campaign being directed against you. Information is being weaponized against Ukraine now, so I'm not 100% sure how you combat that, but stay open and free at the same time, because what the people who are trying to destroy democracies are doing now is using democracies' freedoms against democracies. And we're seeing that now. We've had interference in our election process because it's free to be able to go in and put stuff on Facebook, even if it's a lie. Do I want Facebook policing what people can put up? I'm not sure, because then you go down a path of who decides who can say what. You asked a great question, and I'm afraid there's no great answer to it, except maybe my colleague has a great answer.
Thanks. Well, I think that we're in a transitional period. The old, go back 20 years or so, to have a media voice, you had to have probably a registration, a license, a lot of money, investment, a platform. It wasn't easy to do. Now, in you give someone half an hour, they've set up a website, they've put a brand up, they're an outlet. It's become, we're in the Wild West era of information, of multimedia, let's say, and this raises a lot of issues in terms of control. I think if we talk about the specific aspect in terms of, again, Ukraine as the front line in the information war, as an area where, a testing ground for information warfare, I think that it is justifiable to restrict, in my personal opinion, it is justifiable to restrict Russian access to Ukraine media-wise, because the Russian media is, again, in my opinion, is weaponized, is a part of the Russian war machine. But there are limits to that as well. I think if we take the specific example that you mentioned of the OSCE media conference, I think Ukraine as a host of an international event should have allowed them to come in, because they were invited by the international organization which Ukraine had allowed to hold the event in Kiev. Now, they could have placed some restrictions and said, we don't want you, doing X, Y, Z while you're here, or maybe that would have been impossible to police, I don't know. But I think in that instance, that was actually playing into Russia's hands somewhat. I would liken it to, if we go back a year to Eurovision, when the Russians elected the very sympathetic figure of the lady in a wheelchair who'd been to Crimea to represent them, knowing that there was a very good chance Ukraine would ban them. And of course, Ukraine did ban this artist, and then there was a huge campaign around her to try and generate sympathy, and it felt like Ukraine had walked into a trap, an information trap, which had been set for them, and they'd simply done it. So I would say, yes, there should be, I don't think there's ever been or ever can be total free speech. You can't incite murder, you can't incite crimes, you can't incite attacks, so where do you draw those lines? But I think when it comes to a situation like that, where Ukraine has welcomed an international organization to host an event, if they choose to invite people from Russia, that's part of the obligation of the host, frankly speaking. But again, I think yes, you have to. You can't. I don't think it would. I think it would be insane to have a situation where you had Russian journalists on Kreshadek beaming propaganda out against Ukraine, inciting war against Ukraine, from the comfort of the hospitality of Ukraine itself. I think that would be literally bizarre. And that's not something that you would see, that's not like an exception like that Ukraine did. I mean, you wouldn't find German reporters running around England in 1940 during the Battle of Britain, that they weren't allowed. That's normal in times of war. That's actually nothing exceptional about that. and Ukraine doesn't need to apologize for doing that. But I would actually make the point, if I may, about this issue. I think if you look at the Ukrainian media, it's actually pretty pluralistic, considering you're talking about a country that is at war with a very, overwhelmingly powerful foe. Channels like Inter, for example, broadcasting a lot of Russian content, a lot of Russian stuff. That will be shocking that's shocking for foreigners to encounter. You have channels like News One putting across pretty pro-Russian opinions sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes. I mean, it's not the case that there is no diversity of opinion on Ukraine news. I mean, it's not a one message option. You don't get the same messages coming channel by channel. There is a certain amount of diversity there. Now, you can question the professionalism of the way it's done, you can question the motives of the different owners, but fundamentally, it's quite diverse, surprisingly so, I would say, given the context of the war and the context of Ukraine's post-Soviet transformation. I think actually it's one of the areas where Ukraine can be quite proud of itself.
Скажіть, будь ласка.
Tell us, please, what do you think? Is it plausible that the sanctions against Russia would be lifted, even if it doesn't see its dirty war in the East or doesn't give us the Crimea back? Because I believe if the sanctions will be lifted, then the force will win, not the logics will win.
One thing I've learned never to do is comment on U.S. government policy, because I have no idea. I think there's a NATO meeting coming up in another few days or so, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sure it's a big week, yeah. So and I think there's going to be a meeting between the president of the U.S. and president of Russia. I'm sure they'll talk about Ukraine, but so far what I've heard is that there's firm agreement, at least in the U.S. Congress, et cetera, that the sanctions are going to stay in place. So I think that's pretty firmly said and repeated. I think they're locked in, actually, and I've heard, just even from being here just a few days, that at least among the diplomats and the State Department, et cetera, there's no talk at all about about removing sanctions, and Ukraine remains a unitary country, and that includes Crimea. But I'm not a diplomat. I'm a journalist, so I don't know.
I would concur. I mean, I would say if we look at again, let's not tempt fate. Because who knows, and Mr. Trump is not a man to be second-guessed. But if we look at the reality of the situation, ever since sanctions were first imposed in 2014, various different European governments make noises. The Hungarians, the Cypriots, now the Italians. Sometimes it might be the German foreign minister, and they say, oh, you know what, we've got to find a more productive way. We've got to do this, we've got to do that. And then they go to Brussels, and in 7.5 minutes, they all vote yes, and it continues. So this is actually them talking to their domestic audience, their domestic voters, and also talking to Moscow and saying, hey, look, I tried, I'm a good guy, give me some money. I tried to help you, but it didn't help, didn't work. Sanctions get continued virtually automatically every single time, and they've been extended now 8 times for a half-year period. So I don't think there's any real reason to assume that Europe's going to suddenly say, you know what, that was a mistake, we're going to cancel it. That's Europe, that's the EU. America, my understanding is that they are locked in, that Congress has basically passed legislation which makes it very difficult for Mr. Trump to unilaterally change them. So I think we're locked into a standoff now. Russia won't go back. Let's hope they don't go forward. I think that's unlikely, but again, you never know. Don't want to tempt fate, but it looks like they're not going to move. The West can't move. Ukraine's in the middle. What can Ukraine do? Ukraine needs to just, Ukraine wins by being successful and loses by being unsuccessful. And fundamentally, that means as a society, economically, socially successful. If Ukraine is attractive, Ukraine wins. If Ukraine is unattractive, then Russia wins. And I think that's what it's going to come down to. I don't see a big breach in the sanctions regime, and I don't see the Russians making any concessions, unfortunately. So I think that we're in a long-term struggle where the decisive factor is going to be Ukraine's performance, Ukraine's ability to create a functioning and attractive model.
Дякую. Чи є ще запитання?
Thank you so much. Any further questions?
As it is it really applicable to the war Russia against Ukraine? Because it is very special kind of conflict, 5 centuries long, with very uneven sides in it. Isn't it like the conflict between wolves and sheep? Thank you.
It's an uneven conflict. If there were an all-out war between Ukraine and Russia, I don't think Ukraine would be able to, on its own, defend itself without international help. But even still, Russia's a huge superpower. But look. But no. But what? Let me just say a couple of things, which is, I covered Indonesia a lot. And about 20 years, and East Timor was taken over, invaded and occupied by Indonesia in the 1970s. And they annexed it. They declared it was a province of Indonesia. For 20 years, I was going to Indonesia and I would try to ask questions about East Timor. There was an independence movement there and they crushed it very violently. I got to know Ramos Horta, who was the leader of the East Timor independence movement, a Nobel Prize winner. And every time we tried to bring up questions about East Timor, they would just shut us down. Sometimes not even let you in the country if you tried to ask questions about East Timor. But eventually, East Timor became free. It became free 20 years ago. This year, I believe, they had an independence referendum. It was actually 1999. And ultimately, this little tiny country is, I believe now, one of the newest countries in the world, East Timor. So, it took a long time, but it eventually, won its independence. So, sometimes in life, David does beat Goliath. It does happen, occasionally. So sometimes the sheep can get one over on the wolf. It might take time and perseverance and a lot of international friends.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you could argue that Russia's a wolf. I wouldn't call Ukraine a sheep by any stretch of the imagination. I think Ukraine is actually far stronger than that, and I think that they've shown that. Yes, from a purely military point of view, of course, Russia has the capability to totally destroy Ukraine. Russia has the capability to destroy Europe. That's a military fact. Russia could occupy Ukraine, but in my opinion, it couldn't hold it. It would need to deploy approximately, according to different military estimates, around 200,000 to 300,000 soldiers to occupy Kiev alone. And they would have their hands full. Now, can you imagine an army of occupation of 2 million Russians, most of them conscripts from the back end of Siberia, in Ukraine, facing a strong partisan movement? It wouldn't be the end of the Putin regime, it would be the end of Russia. And they understand that. So I don't think that the full-scale military option is on the table in the Kremlin, again, without wanting to tempt fate. So I think that Ukraine's hand is not as weak as it may appear in a simple comparison of forces. Ukraine is defending its own land. Ukraine is morally in the right, if one can say such things about the complex international issues. I think fundamentally it is. It's defending its own country, so by definition it holds the moral high ground. So to touch on the idea of hundreds of years of conflict, I think it's dangerous to talk about it in such simple terms. I think there are long periods where you can't talk about Ukraine and Russia in direct conflict. There's so many people who do not feel that. They do not feel animosity towards Russia, and Russians who certainly don't feel animosity towards Ukraine. And that needs to be recognized. I think to deny that is to, not only is it an injustice to history, or inaccurate, it's dangerous as well, because you have to recognize the realities of what's happening on the ground. Why is it that someone who's sympathetic to Russia is not necessarily a traitor. Now, it's very problematic in the current environment to address these issues, but we still have to recognise that. That's the case for people all over Ukraine, not just simply in certain areas which are stereotypically regarded as more pro-Russian than others. There's lots of people I know personally who are very distressed by the breach between Russia and Ukraine. It doesn't mean that they think Putin should send the tanks into Kiev, but they'd much rather see a friendly relationship between Russia and Ukraine. And that also needs to be recognised, I think. So it's a very complex conflict in that respect. It's not simply, two tribes go to war and, the winner's the last man standing. I think ultimately the goal has to be an environment where Russia and Ukraine, where Russia respects Ukraine's independence and sovereignty, and they become more of a partners. But for that to happen, it's going to take many, many years, maybe generations, maybe decades. But that's got to be the ultimate goal, in my opinion.
Could I just add something? I mean, it could take a long time to resolve some of the border issues, but at some point, Russia and Ukraine are going to have to learn to live with each other. And I look now, China and India are still fighting over, border areas. They have not settled their border, and occasionally there's a flare-up here and there. But, the Prime Minister of India was just in China. But again, they still have these flare-ups on the border. India and Pakistan still have an unsettled border. There are many countries that are neighbors that have these unsettled border conflicts going on. So, I don't know, you could end up being in for a long period of kind of low-level warfare, but, maybe not hot warfare.
Yeah, I would just add to that comparison. I think the uniqueness of the Ukraine-Russia scenario is that Russia is not, Russia doesn't have territorial ambitions for parts of Ukraine. It believes Ukraine is Russia, fundamentally, and that's the exceptional aspect that makes it perhaps so problematic. That until that worldview, that mindset that Ukraine is part of Russia. Which I've heard Russians say many times to me as a foreigner, as a sort of third party would say, oh, you don't really understand Ukraine, it's Russia, which they may not necessarily say publicly, but of course Mr. Putin often says Russia and Ukraine are one people, and he stands by that, and that's a shocking thing to say, or would be shocking. I mean, it would be obviously if we take the China-India, the Chinese Premier said, the Indians, they're all Chinese, so that would just be insane. Putin says that about Ukrainians. He says they're well, he says that he didn't say they're Russians, he said they're one people. So, what's the implication, that the Russians are Ukrainians? No, it's that the Ukrainians are Russians, which is clear. So, that's the historic factor that needs to be got through. And we have to see, we have to see where it goes with Ukraine's own nation building. Again, Ukraine's victory lies in Ukraine's success. And that doesn't necessarily, that doesn't imply Russia's defeat. It just implies reaching a point where there is an acceptance of the separation of the two countries.
Thank you. Чи є ще запитання до наших спікерів?
Any further questions to our speakers?
Questions. If you have any remarks? No.
Just in conclusion, I just want to again thank the Ukraine Crisis Media Center for having us here. I hope to come back at some point, and maybe I'll know a little bit more about Ukraine and your conflict the next time I come back here again. I want to thank the U.S. Embassy again and their terrific speakers program for having me out, and all of you guys for doing a terrific job. And it's under tough circumstances. It must be very, very difficult to be a journalist covering this conflict now. So my hat's off to all of you guys. So I'll be paying a lot more attention to the news now, and hopefully you'll even get some of these Western reporters who come down here better educated on Ukraine.
Yeah, nothing to add. Just again, my thanks also. It's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure talking to you and sharing my thoughts, our thoughts with you, and responding to your questions. And good luck with all your endeavors.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richburg.
Дуже
Pleasure having you.